Meet Rachel, a woman whose life has been defined by sacrifice, love, and betrayal. For years, she put everyone else's needs before her own, until one devastating heartbreak forced her to confront the truth. She had been living for others, not herself. This gripping story takes you through her painful journey of self-discovery, courage, and the ultimate choice to embrace her own happiness. Will Rachel find peace and love again? Stay tuned to find out. Where are you tuning in from? Don't forget to subscribe to keep following Rachel's transformative journey. Rachel had been away for 5 long years, working tirelessly as a caretaker for a wealthy family in the Middle East. She had spent those years in a foreign land, isolated from the life she once knew, her only solace being the thought that she was doing it all for her family. Every month, a portion of her salary was sent home, where it kept her parents and younger brother Luke afloat. Her sacrifices were immense, but Rachel never minded. After all, family was everything. She often reminded herself that it wouldn't be forever. Mike, her brother, would graduate college soon, and then Rachel would finally be able to come home and live the life she had put on hold for so long. When the day finally came, Rachel stood in her childhood home, breathing in the familiar smells of her mother's cooking and the sounds of the soft murmur of the television. It was as if nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. She had returned to the United States to start over, to marry Jason, the man she had promised to be with when she returned. Their love had been steadfast, even through the distance. Jason had been patient, understanding of her need to support her family, always waiting for the day when they could finally be together without the weight of financial pressure hanging over their heads. The evening of her return, the family gathered for dinner. The table was filled with dishes her mother had carefully prepared, welcoming her back with open arms. Rachel had expected a warm, joyful reunion, but instead, her mother's words shattered the illusion of happiness she had clung to. "Aren't you going back overseas, honey?" her mother asked abruptly, as if she had not just returned home after years of absence. Rachel's heart sank. She had barely taken a bite of her meal before her mother's question hung in the air, heavy with expectation. Her mother's voice was calm, but Rachel could hear the underlying tone of worry. She hadn't even had the chance to enjoy being home before the reality of her family's expectations came crashing down. "Mom," Rachel began slowly, her voice strained as she set her fork down. "Mike's graduated now. I won't need to go back to the Middle East. Jason and I. We're getting married." Her words hung in the air, but the moment she spoke them, she could see her mother's face fall. Her mother's grip on her spoon tightened, the silence that followed suffocating. The sound of the spoon clattering against the plate echoed in Rachel's ears as her mother looked at her, incredulous. "Getting married," her mother's voice cracked. "What about us? What will we do without you? I can't believe you're really going to do this, Rachel. We'll struggle again. And what will the neighbors think? You're the one holding us together." Rachel's stomach churned. She had expected this, but hearing it from her mother felt like a punch to the gut. It was as if nothing she had done, nothing she had sacrificed, mattered. It was always about them. Her mother's face flushed with anger, her words sharp, but Rachel stood firm, her hands clenched in her lap. "I promised Jason that once Mike graduated, I'd stay here and marry him. I'm not going back overseas. Mom, you have to understand." Her mother's expression twisted with disbelief. "I don't care what promises you made, Rachel. You're the only one who can provide for this family. We're relying on you, and you're just going to walk away." Tears welled in Rachel's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her father, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally looked at her with his soft eyes, signing to her, as he always did when words failed. Even though he couldn't speak, he always found a way to communicate his love and support. Rachel's heart ached as she watched her father smile at her, his gesture offering comfort. He, too, understood her need for happiness. "I'm not abandoning you, Mom," Rachel said softly, her voice trembling. "I've done everything I could for this family. I'll still help out, but I can't put my life on hold forever." Her mother's face hardened, and before Rachel could say another word, she stormed away from the table, leaving Rachel frozen in her seat, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. Luke, who had been quiet up until that point, spoke softly. "Rachel, you deserve this. You've given everything to us." Rachel wiped her eyes, trying to steady her breath. "I just want to live my life. I can't keep doing this." That night, she lay in bed, unable to sleep, her mind racing. She had spent years in the Middle East, sacrificing everything for her family's well-being, and yet it never seemed enough. She was torn between what she had always known and what she now realized she wanted for herself: peace, happiness, and the chance to love and be loved in return. But as her mother's face haunted her mind, Rachel was left wondering if she could truly have it all. The days following that intense dinner were nothing but a whirlwind of emotions for Rachel. She could barely focus on anything, her thoughts constantly drifting back to her mother's harsh words. The image of her mother's face, twisted in disbelief and fear, haunted her. It wasn't that Rachel didn't understand her mother's worries. The financial struggles had always been there, and Rachel had been the pillar holding everything up for as long as she could remember. But this was different. It was her future, her happiness, and that meant something too. Yet, her mother's sharp refusal to let go felt like a weight she couldn't escape. Jason had been trying to reach her since that night. His messages flooded her phone, each one more desperate than the last. "Where are you? What's going on? I'm worried. Let's talk on. I'm worried. Let's talk." But Rachel didn't have the heart to respond. How could she explain everything to him? He was her rock, her constant throughout the years, but the world seemed to be falling apart around her, and she didn't know where to stand. It was a quiet afternoon when Rachel finally decided to meet Jason. She had to tell him what had happened, even though she dreaded it. The moment she saw him, waiting patiently at their usual coffee shop, a tightness gripped her chest. He looked exactly the same, with that easy smile that had once been so comforting. But now it felt like a stranger's smile, unfamiliar and distant. "Hey," Rachel greeted softly, sitting down across from him. The familiar smell of coffee and pastries filled the air, but it did nothing to calm the chaos inside her. Jason's eyes softened when he saw her, but the relief in his expression quickly morphed into concern. "Rachel, you look like you haven't slept in days," he said, his voice laced with worry. "What's going on? I've been trying to reach you." Rachel let out a long, shaky breath. She could feel the tears pressing against her eyes, threatening to spill. "Jason, I can't go through with the wedding. Not now," she whispered, her voice cracking. His brows furrowed in confusion, and for a moment he said nothing. He reached across the table, gently touching her hand. "What do you mean? We've been planning this for so long. I thought, my mom, she's not okay with it. She's terrified that I'll abandon them. She locked me in my room the day of the wedding, Jason. She won't let me go." Rachel's voice trembled with the weight of the truth, and the moment the words left her mouth, she felt a crushing wave of guilt. Jason leaned back, the shock evident on his face. "She locked you in." I don't know what to say." "I don't know what to say either," she whispered, her eyes falling to the table. "But it's not just that. It's everything. I've been giving everything to my family for so long. My mom, she won't let me have anything for myself. She won't let me have anything for myself. She needs me, Jason, and I don't know if I can just leave them behind." Jason sat there processing her words, He squeezed her hand, his expression now one of pain and understanding. "Rachel, I get it. You've been caring so much for them, and I know that means everything to you. But what about us? What about what we've built together? You deserve to be happy too." Rachel shook her head. "I can't just abandon them. I can't leave them in this state. I promised I would stay and help them." Jason's eyes narrowed, a faint trace of frustration creeping into his voice. "You've been helping them for years, Rachel. You've done more than anyone could ever ask. But what about you? What do you need?" Her heart ached at the words, but she couldn't allow herself to be selfish, not now. "I don't know if I can live with myself knowing I'm not doing enough for them. It feels wrong, Jason. You don't understand. It feels like everything I've done. It feels like everything I've done. Everything we've planned is falling apart." Jason looked at her for a long moment, his gaze softening as he seemed to search for the right words. "I love you, Rachel. But I can't keep waiting for you to make a decision. If you can't be with me now, if you can't trust that we can make it work together, then maybe we need to reconsider everything." Rachel felt the ground beneath her shift. The pain in her chest intensified. She loved him, she did. But there was a war waging inside her, between the woman she was trying to become and the one she'd always been. She couldn't leave her family, but she also couldn't keep stringing Jason along, pretending like everything was fine. "I can't make a decision like this. Not right now," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to do." Jason nodded slowly, his eyes hardening as he stood up, the weight of their conversation sinking in. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. "I'll be here when you're ready to choose. But you need to make that choice, Rachel. For yourself, if not for anyone else." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Rachel at the table, her heart torn in two. She watched him disappear into the crowd, the finality of his words echoing in her mind. The silence around her felt deafening, and in that moment, Rachel knew that the hardest part was yet to come. She had to choose, not just between family and love, but between the life she had always known and the life she had dreamed of. And she didn't know if she was ready for either. Rachel sat at the small kitchen table, staring at her phone in silence. The screen blinked with dozens of missed calls and messages from Jason, all asking the same thing. "Where are you?" The weight of the world pressed down on her chest, but she couldn't bring herself to respond. How could she explain what had happened? How could she make him understand the turmoil inside her when even she couldn't make sense of it all? She had been locked in her room by her own mother, the one person who was supposed to support her, to love her unconditionally, and yet it felt like she had betrayed her in the worst possible way. Her mother had been so firm, so unyielding. It wasn't the first time Rachel had felt like a pawn in her mother's game, but this was different. This time, it wasn't just about providing for the family. It was about control. Her mother's fear of losing her, of seeing their world crumble without Rachel's financial support, had driven her to lock her in a room on the very day she was supposed to marry Jason. She had tried to escape, pounding on the door, calling out to her mother in desperation, but it was no use. The lock had been too strong, and her cries had fallen on deaf ears. The hours had passed slowly. Every minute felt like an eternity as Rachel's mind spiraled with anger, sadness, and confusion. She had been so sure, so ready to step into a new chapter of her life with Jason. But now, as the shadows of that locked room crept into her thoughts, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was slipping through her fingers. She had always known her mother was controlling, but she had never imagined it would come to this. The door had finally opened, but not in the way Rachel had hoped. Her father, who had always been silent in their household, had stood at the threshold, holding a padlock in his hand. His face was filled with concern, but his silence spoke volumes. He hadn't locked her in. He was as much a prisoner in this house as she was. When she saw him standing there, Rachel's heart broke. She had always tried to protect her family, to give them everything she could. But now, she realized just how much she had sacrificed for them, and yet they still saw her as nothing more than a provider. Her mother entered the room shortly after, her face softening when she saw Rachel. "Honey, But Rachel cut her off before she could finish. "You locked me in, Mom. On the day I was supposed to marry the man I love." Rachel's voice was shaky but firm. "How could you do that?" Her mother looked away, guilt written all over her face. I didn't know what else to do. You've given so much to us, Rachel. I can't let you leave us. You're the only one who can keep us afloat." Rachel shook her head, feeling a mix of anger and heartbreak. "I'm not abandoning you. I've always taken care of you. But I can't live my life for you anymore, Mom. I need to live for myself." Her mother's tears filled her eyes as she stepped forward, reaching for Rachel. "I'm sorry, honey. I just couldn't bear the thought of losing you. I was afraid of what would happen if you left." Rachel's heart softened, but she couldn't ignore the truth that had become too clear to ignore. "I've been giving everything to you, Mom. For years. But I can't keep doing this. I'm not a machine. I'm a person. I'm not a machine. I want to be happy too." The weight of her mother's apology hung in the air, but Rachel knew that things would never be the same. Her mother had always seen her as a caretaker, a provider, and nothing more. It was a hard truth to swallow, but it was the reality she had to face if she wanted to move forward. She couldn't keep sacrificing her happiness for people who would never fully understand her. After an agonizing silence, Rachel finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I love you, Mom, but I can't keep putting everyone else first. I have to do this for me." Her mother nodded, her face a mixture of regret and understanding. "I know, honey. Rachel pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly despite the anger that still burned in her chest. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll still be here for you, but I need to live my life too. I need to live my life too. I need to be with Jason." As Rachel stepped away, she felt a strange sense of clarity wash over her. The decision was made. She wouldn't let her past hold her back anymore. The wedding may have been ruined, but her future was still hers to claim. She wiped the tears from her eyes and took a deep breath, knowing that no matter how difficult it was, she was finally going to take control of her own destiny. That night, Rachel called Jason. Her heart raced as she dialed his number, unsure of what he would say. Would he understand? Would he still want her, after everything that had happened? The phone rang once, then twice before he picked up. "Rachel?" Jason's voice was soft, but there was a noticeable edge to it. "What happened?" "I'm so sorry, Jason," she began, her voice cracking. "I've been through a lot today, and I don't know what to say. But I need you to know that I still love you. I want to be with you more than anything." Jason was quiet for a long moment, and Rachel feared that he might hang up, that the damage had been done. But then he spoke again, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "I've been waiting for you, Rachel. I've been waiting for you, Rachel. I'll wait as long as it takes. I love you too." Her heart swelled with relief. Despite everything, there was still hope. And that was all Rachel needed to start rebuilding her life. The days following the heart-wrenching events felt like an endless storm. Rachel's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, disbelief, and a crushing sense of loss. Her mother's betrayal had left deep scars, and even the comfort of knowing Jason had once been her safe harbor now felt tainted by the lies she'd uncovered. The revelation that Jason had cheated on her hit her like a tidal wave, sweeping away any remaining hope that the future they had planned together could still come to fruition. What hurt the most wasn't just the act itself, but the fact that she had believed in him, trusted him with her heart, and yet here she was, standing alone, surrounded by the wreckage of a love she thought would last forever. Rachel had always given everything to the people she loved. Her family, her fiancé, her friends. She had poured her heart into them without hesitation. But now, after the betrayal and the heartbreak, she realized that she had been neglecting the one person who mattered most, herself. For so long, she had been so focused on the needs of others, on being the provider, the caretaker, the one everyone could depend on, that she had lost sight of her own happiness. The mirror held back a stranger, someone she had forgotten in the pursuit of making everyone else's lives easier. Her heart ached for the girl who once dreamed of a life filled with love, happiness, and the chance to build a family. But now, that dream felt shattered, like a puzzle whose pieces no longer fit. Rachel spent the following days in a haze. She barely left her room, drowning in her thoughts, and wondering where she had gone wrong. Jason's calls came incessantly, each one more desperate than the last. She had no idea how to respond, what to say to the man who had once promised her everything. Every message from him felt like a reminder of what had been stolen from her, of the future she had envisioned slipping through her fingers. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him for what he had done, and even if she could, was it enough? Was it worth fighting for a love that had already shown its cracks? But one afternoon, when she could no longer stay in the suffocating silence of her room, Rachel decided to leave. She needed to clear her head, to breathe somewhere else, to feel like she was alive again. Without a destination in mind, she drove aimlessly, her hands gripping the steering wheel, the wind whipping through the open windows. She drove for miles until she found herself at the beach, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, calming her in a way nothing else had in days. It was here, alone with her thoughts, that Rachel realized something profound. She had the power to choose. She didn't need to stay stuck in the past, dwelling on what Jason had done, or what her mother had taken from her. She could move forward, even if it meant leaving everything behind. As Rachel sat on the sand, staring out at the vast ocean, she made a decision. She wasn't going to be the victim anymore. She wasn't going to allow her past mistakes, her broken relationships, or the hurt she had suffered to define her. She was done allowing others to dictate her worth. It was time for her to rebuild, not just her life, but herself. The first step would be letting go of Jason. For good. She had always tried to hold on to him, to believe in the love they once shared, but the truth was staring her in the face now. Jason wasn't the man she thought he was, and she didn't need him to feel whole. Rachel's heart ached as she thought of the love she had lost, but the pain didn't last long. A new determination began to blossom within her. She wasn't going to let betrayal break her. She was strong enough to rebuild, to create the life she had always wanted, one where she could be happy, independent, and free. As she stood up from the sand and made her way back to the car, she felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, Rachel felt like she was taking control of her own future. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, heartaches, and moments when she'd feel like giving up. But as Rachel drove back home, she knew one thing for certain. She would never again put herself in a position where she had to sacrifice her happiness for someone else. She was no longer just Rachel, the caretaker. She was Rachel, the woman who was going to reclaim her life and love herself first. And that was all she needed to begin anew. When she finally picked up the phone to block Jason's number, she did it with a sense of finality. She wasn't going to let his betrayal define her. She had something far more important to find: herself. Rachel hadn't expected to feel this lost, this hollow after everything she had been through. The days following the end of her relationship with Jason were a blur of emotions. One moment she would feel relief, the weight of his betrayal lifting off her shoulders, and the next, she'd feel like she was falling into an abyss, unsure of who she was or what her life would be like moving forward. For so long, she had been tied to the idea of what her life with Jason would look like, their wedding, their future. It was supposed to be a beautiful story, but now that dream felt like a lie, a fantasy shattered into pieces she could never put back together. In the midst of her confusion and sadness, Rachel decided to reach out to Dylan, a man who had entered her life unexpectedly. He had been a quiet presence, someone who had listened when she needed to talk, offered advice when she felt uncertain, and shown a kind of support she hadn't realized she needed. Dylan had witnessed her heartbreak, but instead of pushing her to make decisions or demanding answers, he had simply been there. Rachel couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward him. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something more. It was comfort, a sense of calm she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it was the vulnerability they shared, both of them haunted by their pasts, or maybe it was simply his ability to offer her space without judgment. Whatever it was, it felt different from anything she had experienced with Jason. It was quiet, steady, and Rachel needed that steadiness more than anything right now. One evening, Rachel found herself sitting across from Dylan at a small cafe, the hum of quiet conversation surrounding them. She hadn't meant to meet him here, hadn't planned it at all, but somehow it felt right. As she looked at him, the comfort in his eyes made her realize just how much she had been craving the simple things. Understanding, care, patience. Dylan wasn't asking her to be someone else. He wasn't rushing her into anything, and he wasn't asking her to forget what had happened with Jason. He was simply there, present in the moment. "How are you really doing, Rachel?" Dylan's voice was soft, but there was a hint of concern beneath the words. He'd asked her this before, but tonight the question felt different. Tonight, it felt like he was offering her more than just a conversation. Rachel smiled weakly, feeling a tear threaten to escape. "I don't know," she admitted. "Some days I feel okay, and then other days I feel like I'm drowning. I never thought I'd be in this position, Dylan. I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I had everything figured out." Dylan nodded, his expression understanding, but he didn't push her. He let her speak. Let the silence between them stretch in a way that felt comfortable, not awkward. "I guess I've just been so focused on everyone else, on my family, on Jason, on what everyone else wanted from me, that I forgot to think about what I want, what I need." She continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've given so much to others, and now that everything's fallen apart, I don't even know who I am anymore." Dylan's hand rested on the table between them, an unspoken offer of support. "I think you're starting to figure that out," he said gently, his eyes soft and kind. "You're here, you're still standing, and you don't have to figure everything out right now. It's okay to take your time." Rachel felt a lump form in her throat. She wasn't used to hearing words like that, words of acceptance, of understanding. She had spent so many years feeling like she had to fix everything, like she was the one who had to hold everyone else together. But Dylan was right. She didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't have to have everything figured out. The more she thought about it, the more Rachel realized that it wasn't just Dylan who had helped her see this new perspective. It was a process itself, allowing herself to heal, to mourn the loss of what she thought her future would be, and slowly, painfully, allowing herself to move forward. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the weight of her past felt unbearable. But sitting here, talking to Dylan, Rachel realized that she was no longer the same person she had been just a few months ago. She had changed. She had grown. And while she wasn't sure what the future held, she knew one thing for certain: she would no longer let anyone, or anything, define her. Over the next few weeks, Rachel found herself spending more time with Dylan, talking about everything and nothing all at once. It wasn't love yet, but it was something. Something that made her feel whole again. Something that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for happiness in her life. And as she slowly let go of the bitterness and pain from her past, she found herself opening up to new possibilities. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a long while, Rachel felt like she was ready to walk it. The weeks that followed felt like an uncharted road for Rachel, full of uncertainty, but also tinged with an unexpected sense of peace. She had made the decision to step away from everything she thought she knew. And while the weight of that choice was still heavy, there was something freeing about it. For the first time in years, she wasn't living to fulfill the expectations of others. She wasn't playing the role of the devoted daughter or the loyal girlfriend. She was just Rachel, and that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Dylan had become a constant presence in her life, but not in a way that felt suffocating or forced. He didn't push her to move on from her past. He didn't rush her into anything. Instead, he simply showed up when she needed him. Whether that meant taking her out for coffee after a long day or sitting in comfortable silence as they watched the sunset. With him, Rachel realized that moving on wasn't about erasing her past. It was about finding the courage to live again, despite the heartbreak and the pain she had endured. One Saturday afternoon, Rachel found herself at the park with Dylan, walking along the path that wound through rows of trees, their leaves beginning to turn with the first hints of autumn. It was a crisp, clear day, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. Rachel had decided to take a break from the overwhelming noise of life and just breathe. As they walked side by side, she couldn't help but think how different everything felt. She felt lighter, like the burden she had been carrying for so long was slowly lifting. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked suddenly, her voice tentative. She was speaking about her old life, the one with Jason, the one with her mother's expectations, the life where she had always been the one to take care of everyone else. Dylan glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. Rachel nodded, her gaze fixed ahead, not wanting to look at him as she spoke. "Yeah, that. I used to think we were going to be everything. I thought I had everything figured out. And now, it feels like it was all just..." Dylan's response was soft, almost hesitant. "You're allowed to miss what you thought it would be. You're allowed to grieve the loss of that dream. But don't let it keep you from seeing what's ahead of you. You're stronger than you think, Rachel." His words were simple, but they struck her like a chord she hadn't realized needed tuning. Dylan was right. She had spent so long mourning the life she had lost that she hadn't allowed herself to think about the future, the life that was still waiting for her, one step at a time. The silence between them was comfortable, each lost in their own thoughts. Rachel felt the cool breeze against her skin and felt herself taking a deeper breath than she had in weeks. The weight she had been carrying, the guilt, the grief, it wasn't gone, but it was starting to fade piece by piece. And for the first time, she realized that the future didn't have to be shaped by her past. It could be something new. Dylan stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression gentle yet serious. "Rachel, you don't have to figure everything out right now. You've already come so far, but one thing I've learned is that sometimes the most important thing you can do is just allow yourself to be happy." Rachel looked at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. He was so different from Jason. Jason had always been about control, about living life according to a plan. But Dylan was about freedom. He was about finding happiness in the small moments, in the quiet spaces between breaths. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Rachel admitted, the words almost a whisper. "I don't know if I can ever truly be happy again. Not after everything." Dylan's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, taking her hand in his. "You don't have to be ready to be happy, but you deserve to feel it. And when you're ready, I'll be here. You're not alone in this, Rachel." For a moment, Rachel felt the tears well up, but she held them back. She wasn't sure what the future held for her and Dylan, or if this was something more than just a fleeting connection. But in that moment, as the sun dipped lower in the sky and the world seemed to stand still around her, she realized something important. She wasn't just moving on from Jason. She wasn't just trying to rebuild her life after the chaos her family had caused. She was choosing to move forward on her own terms, with or without anyone's approval. And that, she realized, was the most powerful thing she could do. The road ahead was still uncertain. There would be days of doubt, days where she felt like giving up. But Rachel was learning to take things one step at a time, one moment at a time. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was on the right path. She didn't need the approval of others to be happy. She just needed to be true to herself. And that was enough. As they continued walking, Rachel felt lighter, freer than she had in years. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time, she was looking forward to the unknown. Rachel's phone buzzed incessantly, a constant reminder of the storm still raging in her life. It had been weeks since she had left Jason behind, weeks since she had made the painful decision to walk away from the future they had once envisioned. Yet his calls and messages kept coming, each one more desperate than the last. He wanted her back. He begged for forgiveness, convinced that he could make things right. But how could she trust him again? How could she go back to a man who betrayed her so cruelly? She hadn't responded to him, not once, since the day she had walked out of the courthouse, her heart heavy with the realization that their love had been built on lies. She had given him everything, only to find that he had been giving his affection to someone else. The discovery had shattered her. Jason's unfaithfulness was a betrayal so deep, so profound, that it left a wound Rachel wasn't sure she could heal from. But as the days passed, the weight of silence began to weigh on her. There was something in Jason's messages that gnawed at her. A feeling that perhaps she was being too harsh, too quick to throw away something that had once meant so much to her. Could she really just walk away from everything they had built together? Was it possible that she was making a mistake? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rachel sat alone in her apartment, the quiet broken only by the hum of the city outside her window. She hadn't planned to pick up the phone. She had told herself time and time again that she was done. But when the familiar ringtone filled the room, Rachel's heart skipped a beat. It was Jason again. The temptation to hear his voice, to understand what he had to say, was too strong. With a trembling hand, she answered. "Rachel," his voice crackled through the phone, and she could hear the desperation in it. "I need to see you. Please. I know I've messed up, but I'm not the man I was. I can't keep living with this guilt. You've always been the most important thing in my life. I need you to understand that." Rachel's throat tightened, and she could feel the tears threatening to spill. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him, to go back to the life they had once dreamed of. But the pain was still so fresh, so raw. She couldn't forget the images of him with someone else, his lies flooding her mind every time she closed her eyes. "I don't know if I can believe you anymore, Jason," she said softly, her voice barely audible. How can I? How can I? How can I trust you when everything you promised was a lie? You broke me. You broke us." There was a long silence on the other end, and for a moment Rachel wondered if he had hung up. But then he spoke again, his voice quieter now, tinged with regret. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Rachel. I know that. But I'm asking for a chance to make it right. Not just for us, but for you. You deserve more than what I gave you. I can't undo the past, but I'll spend every day proving that I can be the man you deserve." Rachel closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. She felt the familiar ache in her chest, the pull toward him that had never truly faded. But she also felt the growing realization that no matter how much she wanted to, she couldn't go back, not to him, not to the life they had. The trust was gone, and once trust was broken, it could never truly be repaired. "Jason, I appreciate your words. I really do," she said, her voice firm now, the strength she had been building in herself finally surfacing. "But I can't keep living in the past. I can't keep holding on to something that no longer exists. You hurt me, Jason, and I have to let go. I have to move on. For me." There was a long pause, and Rachel could hear him taking a deep breath. She imagined him on the other end of the line, his face a mixture of regret and acceptance. He wasn't the man she had thought he was, and no matter how much he wanted to fix things, Rachel realized that the damage was too deep. "I understand," he said quietly, the defeat in his voice unmistakable. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to lose you." "I know," she whispered. "But sometimes things fall apart, and we can't fix them. We have to accept it and move on." With that, she hung up the phone. The silence that followed was deafening, but there was also a strange sense of relief. It wasn't closure, not completely, but it was a step forward. For the first time, in what felt like forever, Rachel realized that she didn't need Jason to define her. She didn't need his forgiveness or his promises. She didn't need his forgive herself to find her own path and to begin again. And so, as the night stretched on, Rachel sat in the quiet of her apartment, the weight lifting from her shoulders. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she was done looking back. She was ready to move forward, to find her own happiness, and to reclaim the life that was hers to create. Rachel had been avoiding the inevitable for days. The weight of everything she had been through, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the chaos of her family's expectations, had finally settled in her chest like an unmovable stone. She had thought she was ready to heal, that walking away from Jason would be enough to put the past behind her. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. There was something still unresolved, something that lingered in the corners of her mind, waiting for her to confront it. It wasn't just about Jason anymore. It was about all the decisions she had made in the past, all the sacrifices, all the moments where she had put herself second for the sake of others. And now, she was standing at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take next. She needed closure, something more than the silent goodbye she had given Jason over the phone. She needed to face him one last time, not for him, but for herself. It was a cool afternoon when Rachel decided to take the plunge. She had spent the morning pacing, trying to convince herself that it was the right thing to do. Dylan had been nothing but supportive, always offering a listening ear. But even he knew that this was something Rachel had to do on her own. She owed it to herself to find peace, to see if there was any last chance at healing between her and Jason. With a deep breath, Rachel grabbed her keys and headed out the door. The drive to Jason's place was a blur, her hands gripped tight on the steering wheel, her mind a tornado of conflicting emotions. Was she doing this because she still loved him, or was she doing it to prove something to herself? Was this closure or just one final attempt at holding on to something that was already gone? When she arrived, she sat in the car for a moment, staring at the building. The old feelings came flooding back. The late nights, the promises they had made, the life they had envisioned together. It was hard to reconcile the person she had once known with a man who had hurt her so deeply. But as the minutes ticked by, Rachel realized that she wasn't going to find the answers sitting in her car. She had to go in, face him, and see if there was anything left worth salvaging. With one final deep breath, Rachel got out of the car and walked up to the door. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was a strange sense of resolve in her step. This was it. No more wondering, no more questions. When Jason opened the door, he looked as surprised to see her as she had felt in the moments before arriving. His expression was a mixture of hope and apprehension, and for a brief second, Rachel saw the man she had fallen in love with. But then the reality of everything they had been through hit her again, and that image blurred, replaced by the man who had betrayed her trust. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice cracking. "You came." "I had to," she replied, her voice steady, despite the whirlwind inside her. "I needed to see you. I needed to hear it from you." Jason nodded, stepping aside to let her in. The apartment was quiet, the remnants of their life together still lingering in the corners, the couch they had picked out, the pictures on the walls. It all felt so foreign now, like a lifetime ago. They sat across from each other, the silence between them thick and uncomfortable. "I know you're angry with me," Jason began, his eyes filled with regret. "I know I hurt you, and I'll never be able to take that back. But I need you to know that I never meant to betray you. I was lost, and I made a terrible mistake. But you've been everything to me, Rachel. You always will be." Rachel took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. "You can't just take back what you did, Jason," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "You can't just erase the hurt. What you did. What you did. What we had. It's not the same anymore." Jason reached out, his hand trembling as he tried to touch hers. "I always have." "I know," she whispered, pulling her hand away. "But love isn't enough. Not anymore." The words hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Rachel felt the weight of everything she had been carrying lift slightly, the finality of the moment settling in. She had come here for closure, and now she had it. There was nothing left between them but the echoes of the past. She had loved him, truly. But love, as she had learned, wasn't just about affection. It was about trust, and once the trust was broken, there was no going back. Jason's eyes filled with tears, and Rachel's heart broke for the man he had once been. But she knew she couldn't keep holding on to the past. She had to let go, for her own sake. "I wish you the best, Jason," Rachel said, standing up to leave. "I really do. But we're not the same people anymore." Jason didn't speak. He just watched her leave, the silence between them louder than any words could be. As Rachel walked out of his life for the last time, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. It wasn't easy. It wasn't the way she had imagined things ending. But as she drove away, she realized that she was free. She had finally let go, and in doing so, she was giving herself the chance to move on, to heal and to find happiness again, on her own terms. Rachel had always been the pillar of her family, the one who held everything together. She had sacrificed so much of her own dreams and happiness to ensure that her mother, father, and brother were taken care of. For years, she had worked tirelessly overseas, sending money home, trying to make sure they never went without. But now, standing in the quiet of her childhood home, she felt the weight of that responsibility pressing down on her like never before. Her mother, despite her best efforts to make things right, had still managed to hurt her in ways Rachel wasn't sure she could ever heal from. The phone call from her mother had come that morning, and Rachel hadn't been able to ignore it any longer. Her mother had begged, pleaded, and even resorted to guilt trips, trying to convince her to stay, to come back home and continue providing for the family. It was the same old story. Rachel was the only one who could keep them afloat, the only one who mattered. But this time, Rachel wasn't willing to fall back into the same cycle. She had worked too hard to get to this point. She had finally begun to see a future outside of the never-ending demands placed on her by her family. "Mom, I'm not going back," Rachel had said, her voice firm. "I can't keep doing this. I've given so much already, but I have to live for myself now. I can't be everything for everyone anymore." The words had tasted bitter on her tongue, but they were true. She had never imagined it would be this hard to make that decision. The guilt weighed heavy in her chest as she thought about her family, especially her brother, who had just started his new job and was no longer depending on her. She had spent so many years fighting for their future that she had forgotten about her own. It wasn't just her relationship with Jason that had fallen apart. It was her relationship with herself. She had neglected her own desires, her own dreams, in favor of others. And now she was paying the price. That afternoon, Rachel took a walk through her neighborhood, the autumn air crisp and cool against her skin. The golden leaves swirled around her feet as she walked, her thoughts tangled in the mess of her emotions. She had been so consumed with trying to make everyone else happy that she had lost sight of what made her happy. It was hard to admit, but she realized that she had allowed her family's needs to dictate her life for far too long. Now, she had a chance to choose differently. She had a chance to choose her happiness. As she walked, the phone in her pocket buzzed again. It was a text from Dylan, the man who had quietly supported her through all of her pain. The one who had shown her that there was still goodness in the world, even when everything felt broken. The message was simple, but it was just what Rachel needed to hear. "I'm thinking of you. Take your time. I'm here whenever you're ready." Her heart swelled at the message. Dylan hadn't pressured her. He hadn't rushed her. He hadn't rushed her. He had simply been there for her when she needed it the most. And as she stood there, on the edge of her old neighborhood, Rachel finally realized something important. She didn't have to keep carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She didn't have to fix everything for everyone else anymore. She could choose to live for herself. And Dylan, with all of his kindness and patience, had shown her that it was possible. Rachel thought about everything she had gone through: the pain of losing Jason, the heartbreak of her family's expectations, the guilt of putting her own needs last. It all felt overwhelming at times. But in that moment, standing in the crisp autumn air, she knew that she had the power to let it all go. She'd already taken the first step by walking away from Jason, by letting go of the life they had once planned. But now, she had to take the next step. She had to live for herself. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs, and smiled. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be days when the guilt crept back in, when the old patterns tried to pull her under again. But Rachel was stronger now. She knew she had the strength to build a life that was hers to live. No one else's expectations, no one else's expectations, no one else's needs would come before hers again. She had already given so much. Now it was time to give something back to herself. Rachel turned toward her apartment, her steps light and purposeful. She was finally ready to embrace the future, whatever it might hold. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she felt ready to walk it, knowing that she had the power to shape it. And as she walked back, her heart lightened with every step. The future was hers to claim, and this time, she would choose her own happiness. The day Rachel had been waiting for had finally arrived, and as she stood in front of the mirror, she couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. The past few months had been a blur of uncertainty, pain, and growth. But here she was, about to marry Dylan, the man who had slowly helped her piece her life back together. The woman staring back at her in the mirror was someone she barely recognized. Someone stronger, someone who had learned the importance of choosing herself, someone who had finally learned to love again. Her white dress fit perfectly, the delicate lace hugging her figure as she adjusted the veil on her head. The light from the window spilled over her, casting a soft glow across her face. She still couldn't believe how far she had come. Just a year ago, she had been lost in the wreckage of her past, unsure of who she was or what her future would hold. Now, as she stood here, about to take this next step with Dylan, she realized just how much she had healed. The road had been long, filled with heartbreak and disappointment, but it had also led her to this moment, and for that, she was grateful. Dylan had been her rock, her constant source of support, the one who never pushed her, never rushed her, and never made her feel like she had to be anyone other than herself. He had given her the space to heal, to find herself again, and in the process, she had found something more. A love she never thought she'd experience after everything she had been through. He was everything she needed: kind, patient, understanding. And most of all, he saw her for who she truly was, not the version of herself that she had been forced to be for so many years. When the door to the small chapel opened, Rachel felt her heart race. She caught sight of Dylan standing at the altar, his eyes filled with anticipation and love. There was no hesitation in his gaze, no doubts, only certainty. She knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was where she was meant to be. The journey they had been on together, the trust they had built, had led them to this very moment, and Rachel realized that, despite the pain of the past, it had all been worth it to reach this point. As she walked down the aisle, supported by her father's arm, Rachel could feel the eyes of the small group of family and friends who had gathered to witness their union. Her mother was there too, seated quietly in the front row, her expression softened with a mix of pride and apology. It had taken a long time for Rachel to forgive her mother for all the guilt she had imposed on her over the years, but in this moment, it didn't matter. Rachel had finally found her own path, her own happiness, and she had chosen to walk it without looking back. Dylan's smile grew as she approached, his eyes never leaving hers. When they finally reached the altar, he took her hands in his touch warm and reassuring. There were no words spoken yet, just the quiet understanding between them, the deep connection that had grown over the months they'd been together. They didn't need words. They had already said everything that mattered with their actions. They had already said everything that mattered with their actions, their love, their support for each other. As the ceremony began, Rachel's thoughts drifted briefly to the past, to the life she had left behind. She thought of Jason, of all the pain he had caused, but she no longer felt the weight of that burden. It was gone now, replaced by the love she had found in Dylan. She'd given so much of herself to the wrong person, and now she was giving herself to someone who deserved her love, someone who would cherish and respect her. That was the greatest gift she could give herself. When it came time to exchange vows, Rachel's heart swelled with emotion. Dylan spoke first, his voice steady and filled with love. "Rachel, from the moment I met you, I knew my life was about to change. You've shown me what it means to truly love and care for someone. You've taught me the importance of patience, of understanding, and of never giving up on the people who matter most. I promise to love you, to honor you, and to be your partner through every challenge we face. I will always stand by you, just as I have from the very beginning." Rachel's voice shook slightly as she spoke her vows. "Dylan, I never thought I could love again after everything I had been through. But you've shown me that love isn't just about the past. It's about the future. It's about what we build together. I promise to stand by you, to support you, and to love you with all that I am. I've spent so many years giving everything to everything else, but now I give myself to you. You are my future. and I am so incredibly lucky to walk through life with you by my side." As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Rachel felt the world shift around her. She had finally found the peace she had been searching for, the love she had once thought was lost. Dylan kissed her gently, and in that kiss, Rachel knew she had found the life she had always deserved. They walked down the aisle together, hand in hand, ready to begin their new life as partners. The journey had been long, but the road ahead was full of hope, love, and endless possibilities. For the first time in a long time, Rachel felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Rachel stood at the threshold of her new life, her fingers wrapped around the handle of the apartment door, heart racing with uncertainty. She had spent the past few months trying to piece together a life that was truly her own, free from the constraints of her family's demands and the weight of past relationships. It hadn't been easy, and some days, the road seemed longer than others. But today was different. Today, she had finally made the decision to move forward, to stop looking back at what could have been and embrace the life she was building. She had been avoiding confrontation with her mother for weeks now. The guilt of leaving her family behind, of breaking the promises she had made to be the pillar they relied on, still hung over her like a dark cloud. But Rachel was learning something important. She didn't have to carry the burden of everyone else's happiness anymore. She had tried for years to be everything for everyone, but in doing so, she had lost herself. It was time to stop living in the shadow of other people's expectations. She was ready to face the future, no matter how uncertain it felt. Her mother had called earlier that day, her voice thick with emotion as she tried once again to pull Rachel back into the fold. "Please, Rachel," her mother had pleaded. "You're all we have left. Don't turn your back on us. We're struggling without you." The guilt had almost overtaken her, almost dragged her back into the familiar cycle of self-sacrifice. But Rachel had learned something from her time with Dylan, something that had taken her months to truly understand: the importance of setting boundaries. She had spent so much of her life meeting everyone else's needs, but she had never learned how to meet her own. Dylan had taught her that, had shown her the power of saying no without guilt, the power of choosing happiness for herself. And now, as she sat on the edge of her bed, Rachel knew what she had to do. It wasn't about rejecting her family. It was about acknowledging that she couldn't fix everything. Her mother's fear of abandonment was not Rachel's responsibility to manage. Rachel had done enough. She had sacrificed enough. It was time to choose herself, to build a future that was hers, and hers alone. The phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling Rachel out of her thoughts. She picked it up and saw Dylan's name flashing across the screen. Her heart lifted just seeing his name. He had been her steady rock, her anchor in the storm of her emotions. Every step of the way, he had been there, reminding her that she was worthy of love and happiness, that her needs mattered. "Hey, you," Rachel said, her voice steady but warm as she answered. "Hey, beautiful," Dylan's voice came through the phone, full of affection. "How are you holding up?" Rachel smiled, the sound of his voice comforting her more than she had expected. "I'm okay, actually. I've been thinking a lot today." "About what? About what?" "About everything. About where I've been, where I'm going. I think I'm finally ready to stop looking over my shoulder and start living for me. For once, I don't feel guilty about it. I don't feel guilty about it. There was a pause, and Rachel could hear Dylan's smile through the phone. "Rachel, I'm proud of you. You've come so far. You're ready for this." She took a deep breath, the weight lifting off her shoulders. She wasn't running from her family, and she wasn't abandoning them. She was simply choosing to take control of her own life for the first time in years, and that felt like freedom. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." "I'm always here for you," Dylan replied softly. "You don't have to do this alone. You got me." Rachel's heart swelled with gratitude. It had taken so long for her to find someone who understood her, someone who accepted her flaws, her scars, and still saw her as enough. Dylan was that person, and she knew that together they could face whatever came next. Later that evening, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, as she wrote a letter to her mother. It wasn't easy to put everything into words, but she knew it was something she had to do. She explained her decision, the reasons behind it, and the importance of her own growth. She assured her mother that she wasn't abandoning them. She was simply creating space for her own happiness. As she finished the letter, she felt a sense of calm settle over her. This was the first step toward the life she had always wanted, but had never allowed herself to have. She wasn't running away from her family. She wasn't rejecting them. She was simply choosing herself, and that was something she had never done before. When Rachel sealed the letter and put it in the envelope, she felt lighter. The world still felt uncertain, and there were no guarantees. But for the first time in years, Rachel felt like she was on the right path. She wasn't looking back anymore. She was finally ready to move forward, with Dylan by her side, with the future in her hands, and with the knowledge that her happiness was worth fighting for. Rachel stood at the edge of the beach, the waves gently lapping at the shore, the sun beginning its descent into the horizon. The air was thick with salt and the soft hum of the ocean, but inside, Rachel felt an unfamiliar peace. It was as if the chaos of the past few months had been washed away with each rhythmic wave that crashed against the sand. She had come here to think, to finally make sense of everything that had happened. Her decision to walk away from her past, the breakup with Jason, and the new, uncertain path she was about to embark on. But as she looked out at the water, she realized something. She was no longer lost. For the first time in years, Rachel felt grounded, like she was exactly where she needed to be. It had taken months of soul searching, of crying in the quiet of her apartment, of pushing through the pain and the self-doubt, but Rachel had finally come to terms with the most important truth of all. She was worthy of love, of happiness, and of choosing her own future. She had always been the one who gave everything to others, her family, her relationships, her career, but in the end, she had nothing left to herself. She had been so busy trying to hold everything together for everyone else that she had forgotten to nurture her own dreams, her own desires, but not anymore. Dylan had been a constant presence in her life since she had met him, someone who had patiently stood by her side, never pushing her, never expecting anything from her except honesty. He had been the light in her darkest moments, the one person who had shown her that she didn't have to be perfect, that it was okay to let go of the past, and that it was possible to love again. Their relationship had grown steadily, each moment of connection, a reminder that life wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving. It was about thriving. It was about opening your heart to someone who truly saw you, who accepted your scars, and loved you despite them. Dylan had done that, and for the first time, Rachel felt truly loved. The sun dipped lower, casting a warm glow over the sand, and Rachel turned away from the water, her heart full. She thought about her family, her mother, who had tried so hard to keep her under her control, her father, who had always been silent but supportive in his own way, and her brother, who had finally found his own way in life. Rachel had spent years thinking she was the only one who could keep them together, the only one who could fix everything. But she realized now that she wasn't responsible for their happiness. She could love them, support them, but she couldn't carry their burdens any longer. As the wind brushed through her hair, Rachel made a decision. She would return home and speak to her mother, but not to beg for forgiveness or explain herself. She had already made that clear in her own way. This time, she would go to offer understanding, not to bear the weight of her mother's expectations. She would let her know that she loved her, but she also loved herself enough to live her own life. She had no more apologies to make. It was time for her to step into the future, not as the person everyone expected her to be, but as the woman she had finally allowed herself to become. Rachel's phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts, and she pulled it out to see a text from Dylan. Thinking of you. Hope the beach is treating you well. I'm here whenever you're ready. She smiled, her heart swelling with affection. Dylan had always given her space when she needed it, never rushing her, always reminding her that it was okay to take her time. But she knew now that the time had come. She wasn't just moving on from Jason. She was moving on from the version of herself that had always put everyone else first. She was ready to embrace the future, her future. And Dylan would be a part of that future, not as a savior, but as an equal partner, someone who believed in her as much as she had come to believe in her, as much as she had come to believe in herself. With a deep breath, Rachel turned and started walking back up the beach toward her car. The path was clear now, and as she walked, she felt the weight of the past finally fall away. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't uncertain. For the first time in a long time, Rachel knew who she was, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The future was waiting, and she was ready to meet it head on, confident in the choices she had made and the woman she had become. And no matter what, she would always remember that she had the power to shape her own destiny. As Rachel's journey unfolded, we saw the deep transformation she underwent. From a woman weighed down by the expectations of others, she gradually learned to reclaim her own voice, her own happiness, and her own future. The story is a poignant reminder that sometimes, in order to truly live, we have to let go of the past, whether it's relationships, obligations, or even old versions of ourselves. It's easy to get caught in the role of caretaker, constantly giving to others at the expense of our own well-being. But the most valuable lesson here is that self-love and self-care are not selfish. They are necessary. Rachel's growth shows us that it's okay to choose ourselves. It's okay to break free from the weight of others' expectations and pursue a life that brings us joy. By setting boundaries, embracing change, and accepting the love and support of others, we give ourselves permission to live authentically. In the end, it's not about perfection. It's about being true to who we are and making the choices that lead to personal fulfillment. So, what about you? What are the choices that you need to make in your life to live for yourself? What can you let go of to make room for new opportunities and growth? If you've enjoyed this journey with Rachel, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories and life lessons. And feel free to share where you're tuning in from. I'd love to hear your thoughts and connect with you.